This panel is named How Do We Secure Greater Political Representation for Indigenous People? Indigenous rights are about making sure they are represented, their rights are respected, and they have the right to keep their language, their land, and their culture. It's a topic that we need to keep alive on our tables, and especially on the decision-making tables. So I'm going to start with you, Senator, talking about all the challenges Indigenous communities face every day, especially when talking about political representation. What do you think are the issues that make it hard for Indigenous community to have political representation, not only at the national level, but at the international level as well?
Yes, merci, thank you. I want to say hello to my friend, the former Grand Chief, Sky Deer. I miss you, I love you, and thank you for welcoming us in your beautiful home. I just came back from my home where it's very far, there's no tree and a little bit of snow and lots of mosquitoes, and we welcome youth from different nations. They don't know that we have international bodies or local bodies that works on human rights or works for them, so that part is also a challenge. How do we inform them, or how do we make them involved? The other part also with organizations, sometimes we tend to bring the same people. How do we change and make sure that the accountability, we bring those youth and we make sure that when they come back, their voice can resonate in different territories. Sometimes it stay there because lack of funding or many other reasons. But thank you for many organizations like this one to make sure that you resonate and remind us, we used to be young, that we're in between now, that we need to make sure that we do honor your voices.
Just to quickly follow up with what you said, is it difficult to keep them informed? Do you have the tools to keep your communities informed about their rights?
In my time, we didn't have iPhone, iPad, whatever. Maybe with this new technology, yes, we can keep them informed, but sometimes a circle, face-to-face, or making sure that how can we make the training or the skill of life, or life was, I don't know more English, sorry, that if I'm in a political position, even if it's not my world and it's not natural for me, we need to go in those spaces, and that generation, you, and like my kids, I have lots of kids, that what we do, you need to be there, so you'll be the next one. You don't need to be old. So that, for me, it's so fast. We're in a survival mode. We lose a lot of young people by suicide, trauma, etc. So that part also, the healing and the empowerment is very important.
Yes. Rebecca, how can we protect the needs and identities of indigenous communities while pushing for more political representation, especially from the young generations?
Yeah, so I think, can you hear me? I think for protection, it's just, we need to have more Indigenous people within these spaces, and that's one of the biggest things, especially as a youth, we need more young leaders in there. Like me as a young person, when I go into these spaces, it's often very nerve-wracking because I'm usually the youngest one there. And so it's like, that's why it's so important for things like this to happen, where we have young people that are wanting to become leaders, that are determined to become leaders, and go into these spaces to really advocate. And so in terms of like, protecting them, I think being true to your culture is a biggest thing as well. Like, your culture is a big protective barrier. Like, I know when I come into these spaces, like a lot of times we usually smudge before we do something like that, which is a traditional medicine in my culture. And we also offer prayers or talk to our elders. And so those are like big kind of protective factors that we have.
Thank you. What are the strategies? You have large experience working with governments. You work with former President Barack Obama. What are the strategies you can say are the most important to keep that representation at the government level, and especially at the decision-making tables?
I think first of all, when you have people put in decision-making capacity, especially if you are the first. I've had a series of first positions, and one of the things that I've noticed is that Oftentimes you're underfunded, understaffed. You're working with colleagues who are not educated on your issues. And so some of those strategies mean that sometimes you have to have Indians 101 sessions with your colleagues, recognizing that you're in a probably friendly environment, and so you can have those discussions, recognizing that if there is an omission, mention of Indian tribes anywhere in policy or statute, that's sometimes means that there is no direct deployment of resources that go to those tribes. I also think it's important to perhaps have a mandate of consultation, some kind of meaningful dialogue with the Native community that's more than just listening, that there is meaningful discussion taking place, and that discussion influences policy development and then implementation of that policy. I also think that there is strength in solidarity, not only solidarity among the communities itself, we all have differences, but where we can come together, we should come together, and where we can build alliances with non-Indigenous communities, we can do that too. And so that only strengthens that effort. When I was in the Obama White House, I had Indian 101 sessions when I worked for the United States House of Representatives. I worked with Republican and Democratic parties with Indians 101. Why is Congress even in the role of legislating in Indian affairs? Because sometimes, these members and their staff have no idea, why are we even working on this issue? Well, there's a legal obligation, right?
You just talk about legislative, and I want to talk about why it's so hard for Indigenous community to have a seat at the legislative level.
It is, in part, and I always say this, we know that, at least in the United States, there is not a lot of education about our community that's taught in the public school system. And so we are in an uphill battle because there are so many people who have no understanding. I'm Cherokee Nation's delegate to Congress. It's a nearly 200-year-old treaty right. Treaties are the supreme law of the land. I have to go back to 19th century federal Indian law policy legislative enactments to discuss why it's taken so long to get us to the place where we can finally assert a treaty right, because most people don't know that forced removal of my people from the eastern part of the United States to Oklahoma, which is where I'm from today, which led to a quarter of our population dying on that forced march, was part of federal policy. And that didn't end there. 19th century policy continued to disrupt and undermine our ability to govern ourselves until the 70s. That's in my lifetime. We even had taken away our ability to elect our own tribal leader. Congress had to restore that right. And so educating about is often hard because our histories, our policy, court decisions, all those things can be hard if you don't learn these things while you're in school systems. That's why we often have to begin with, what I call Indigenous learning or Indians 101 first. So it's kind of hard to do that. Once you break that barrier, though, once you get more people into public office, they become responsible for that. You create champions, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, who can carry the message forward for you, and that will, lead to baby steps and changes over time.
Let me talk to Hana about it, because Hana,
thank you.
You have a seat at the legislative level at such a young age, yet you face so many challenges, not only to fight for your community, but you keep all your rights and your cultures alive. Can we talk about those challenges and how do you work to overcome them?
Tuatahi ake kei taku koe nei pai marire kia koe, and I want to acknowledge the custodians of this land, the First Nations people. E mihi ana kia koutou. We have to remember that these systems weren't designed thinking about that we would ever get into them. So these systems weren't created for us. They weren't created for young people. They weren't created for Indigenous people. They weren't even created for females. So shout out to Maipi-Clarke. I absolutely love you. I heard her saying last night, we have to break down those ceilings and we have to break down those walls. And for me, that looked like literally doing a haka or debating or putting stickers on my laptop and it wasn't allowed.
By the way, you were very brave, and it was great to see you performing the haka there.
I'm just being me and being Māori, and I would do this if I wasn't in Parliament, and I would do it if I was in Parliament. Our culture keeps us safe. And the best way I can keep safe in a system that doesn't accept me or doesn't actually think that I should have the right to be in there, I just execute my culture the best way I can.
Thank you. Senator, do the educational system help or make it harder for political representation of the Indigenous communities?
Just here in Quebec, they have a hard time to mention the true story. I don't know for the rest of Canada, but by keeping people ignorant about those truths of who were the first people and were so alive and still there, and we're not going to go anywhere, that it create a moment like when we lost Joyce Echaquan, an Atikamekw woman. She's sick, she goes to the ER at the hospital, and right away she was pushed as she's an addict, she's drugged, she just came here for...
Labeled.
Exactly, thank you. And she died, and she FaceTimed herself on Facebook Live, So it went around the world reminding Quebec that you're part of the problem and part of the solution, and it's time for you to change. So one of my dream, and it's coming true, that we have our own university, own college. We welcome any culture, but our science, knowledge, passion, love, and history, and who we are today and where we want to go tomorrow, we will be the one owning that space. Mm-hmm. And I know it's going to happen.
Rebecca, for young leaders, how can young leaders fight for the rights of Indigenous communities and don't get involved in the political agendas of parties in different countries?
I would say the biggest thing is stay true to who you are and why you're there. Like, as a young person, you know why you're in these spaces and you know why you're fighting to be in these spaces, because you haven't been accepted in these spaces as an Indigenous young person, which is the biggest thing. And that's what I constantly have to remind myself, because yeah, I go into these spaces and there's so many big political names, there's so many people with their different agendas, but it's like, you can't play into that, because that's not why you're there. You're there to make a difference as a young person, because you have a voice and a perspective that is so unique and needs to be heard, which is such a huge thing that not a lot of people want to do it. And I know previously I had said, and I heard somebody else say that, like, everybody always says that we're the leaders of the future, which is true, but we're also leaders now, and that's so important, because we're here making change now, going into these spaces unapologetic to who we are, to our Indigenous cultures, and just saying what needs to be said and not worrying about what it can, you know what I mean, like what it sounds like to people, because we know what needs to be said and what needs to be done, so.
Yeah. I think it's important for our audience to understand also how political representation, and I'm talking about examples on how political representation really meant something for Indigenous communities and help make that change.
So, obviously my experience is in the United States, and I'm a federal expert because I guess that's most of been my career path as a public servant. And some examples, I think I look at our United States structure. Judicial branch, executive branch, legislative branch, and all three have an impact on our communities. And so all three require a certain amount of strategies. So for example, Cherokee Nation, my tribe, was one of the original plaintiffs in a lawsuit that was meant to challenge and undermine the Indian Child Welfare Act, which was a federal law put in place to protect Indian children in adoption proceedings so they can grow up in their communities and with family. And so for years, this is a late 1970s law, for years these conservative think tanks have really fought to try to get that law overturned. And a case finally made it up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't think just in terms of what if that law does get overturned in part or in whole. So we started a process at educating members of Congress getting them to the point where they were knowledgeable about Indian Child Welfare Act, because if the court were to make a decision undermining that law, then we would have to pivot then to Congress to respond to that court decision, because they can pass a law, once again, trying to make it legal. And so luckily, the U.S. Supreme Court found that the Indian Child Welfare Act was constitutional, and we didn't have to go down that fight, but that was a huge victory. Another victory for us involved an Oklahoma tribe that had a similar treaty right to my tribe. In the U.S. Supreme Court, in a majority decision written by Justice Gorsuch, says at the far end of the trail was a promise. Basically, what that meant was none of the reservations established, at least for the Muskogee Creek Nation in its last treaty with the United States, 1866, these long ago things matter today. Never have their reservation been disestablished. And so that meant our reservation had never been disestablished. It was a groundbreaking, historic decision. Now we're fighting with the state of Oklahoma governor, who's a Cherokee citizen, by the way, because he thinks that the sky's falling, that because the Indian tribes have jurisdiction over the entirety of their reservation, that somehow that makes his state less than. On the executive side of things, using tools before you, executive orders, we were able to put more meat into how we consulted with Indian tribes. It was very important to me that we had meaningful consultation. I often participated in these sessions with our federal agencies because I didn't want federal officials just sitting there staring as tribal leaders read comment after comment. I wanted dialogue to take place. I wanted to have those feedback, matter, but also legislative, and not being afraid to do hard things. Sometimes you have to start with low-hanging fruit in order to gain alliances and solidarity and gain trust and partners. Then you get ready for the hard things. Yes. And the hard things for us was Violence Against Women Act. It's a federal law designed to protect women and children. And so I spearheaded the effort in the Obama administration to make sure that non-Indians who perpetrate domestic violence against women and children were able to be prosecuted by Indian tribes. And that's still the law today, and it has not been overturned by any court because that was the concern.
Bravo.
And so those things matter.
Yes.
Those things absolutely matter. So those are just some examples is figuring. I made a career out of trying to do low-hanging fruit. Sometimes, it doesn't seem important, but I'm also looking for alliances that it creates, and because, believe me, the hard stuff comes, and you've got to be prepared to take advantage of timing and opportunity as well.
Yes. Hana, for you, hasn't been easy, and you have been very open in speaking about how treaties signed by old leaders are not necessarily a benefit for your community. And you have been speaking open about how can we understand a little bit of those treaties and laws that were signed before and are not necessarily benefiting your communities today.
So to kind of explain the context that we're currently facing in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we are facing probably the most right-wing government we've ever had in our lifetimes for generations. There's 13 key legislations that directly affect Indigenous peoples who descend as Māori, from our healthcare to our education systems to removing every single Māori name in government departments. And we have only just celebrated 53 years of our own language being an official language of our country. And we've recently had the removal of local representation in Māori wards, which is basically the Māori representative in local government. And then our biggest issue that we're facing is the Treaty Principles Bill. Now, Te Tiriti o Waitangi is basically our constitution, and it was an agreement between Pākehā settlers or Europeans and Māori to come together and live harmony, whatever, in our country. Basically, it's the ultimate marriage, and you can't divorce it. And that's what's currently been happening. They don't even have the right, this government, to rewrite our core constitution, and that's what we're currently facing.
Let's talk about, Senator, about international organizations like United Nations, for example. How can Indigenous community get more support for organizations like so?
Well, there's already, the community are struggling with the funding when there's multinational industry that extracting resource in their traditional land. So there's a rich environment, and we're the poorest of the poorest. But thanks for many nonprofit organizations, First Nation organizations, and of course for your people that will bring you people to the UN because they register, they have an official accreditation. And I was 28 years old when I was with Quebec Native women. We made sure that we always bring young women, First Nation and Inuit women out there to make sure that they have a voice and there's a legacy when the next one is coming. So funding was an issue, and I'm sure it's still an issue. The information, like I mentioned with your first question, we meet a lot of young people, and most of them don't know that there's an international bodies that are overseeing this country, Canada. And at the Senate also, I know Elena is in the room. She was a former young senator for a week. So to make sure that Canada or international, we make those space, and if we have the funding, let's make sure that we also put in the budget for the Indigenous youth so we can send them where we need to hear their voice.
Thank you. Rebecca, social media, communications, how can the media help and represent and help better representation of the Indigenous community?
The biggest thing is making sure that all of the Indigenous cultures show their distinctness in the media, and also to get rid of the stigmatism that we often face in media. That is the biggest thing, is sometimes we are very stereotyped and they show the very negative aspects of all of the Indigenous culture, which is very terrible for perpetuating the continued stereotypes that we face. And so I think the biggest thing is making sure that Indigenous stories and the Indigenous narrative is true to what it is, because we face a lot of that discrimination because what people see in the media and what they hear on the media. Social media can be the biggest and the best tool if it's used right. And so that's why we need to see more Indigenous people, more Indigenous content creators, more Indigenous media kind of outlets to be taking over that narrative for the Indigenous people, to make sure that it's not kind of the Western society and the colonial lens that's being put out, and instead our stories are being put out how they're properly supposed to be put out by Indigenous people. And so that's kind of the biggest thing that I think is just making sure that we have more of our people in there and that the narrative is our own.
Perception.
Yeah.
Perception. Have you faced backlash just because of perception of what an Indigenous politician is?
I don't know that I've faced backlash. I have faced discrimination. I mean, that's reflective in the policies, and that still haunt us today. My own people in the 19th century were forcibly removed from their homelands, and so it was done because there was this policy there of forced removal in order to make way for white settlers to gain our land. And when I think back at the broader picture of discrimination and that history, you can't help but recognize that those were non-Indians making decisions for our people. And so that's why it's been absolutely important to educate on that history, but also to develop and then complement policies of self-determination. The fact that every tribe and every Indigenous peoples have a right to chart their own destiny. And when they chart their own destiny, they thrive. When they don't, then we've seen the kind of catastrophic policies that can take place as a result of that, the kinds of discrimination that can result in that. And so the only kind of backlash, I guess, that I have faced is the fact that I'm oftentimes the only one in the room screaming at the top of my voice for Indigenous rights. We often are undercounted, but we're the minority of the minority in the United States. And so even if we scream at the top of our lungs, so we have to work on visibility, and that can be frustrating at times. But what Rebecca just said, we're seeing changes now, at least in the United States. We have the very first cabinet member who is a Native woman, a dear friend of mine, and who was also one of the first two Native American women to be serve in Congress. We have 6 federal judges that are Native in the United States, 5 of them in this current administration. So the glass ceiling is breaking. We finally have creatives. We finally have movies being made where the directors and producers are telling the story based on our perspective and giving authenticity to the story. So what Rebecca said is spot on. We need more people in the media. We need more people because there's diversity within our own community to tell the message and to tell the to tell the authenticity of it as well, and so that that helps in the long run with all of our work.
Yeah, and it has to be a commitment from all of us. And
Absolutely.
that takes us to my last question about how can non-Indigenous communities get involved in helping you protect and fight for your rights, protect your culture, your languages, and fight for your rights?
Yeah, I think I deem myself as being very privileged. I was privileged enough to go into I'm a first language speaker. For 3 generations, we didn't have our language in our family, and I've been privileged enough to go to a full immersion school, all in our language, teaching our traditional knowledge, teaching us our traditional performances and arts and culture. And I see so much of kids who are Māori who don't have those same experiences, which equal not being able to have learnt their true identity, which causes so much hurt for our people and generational trauma. And that's the key thing. Let us have our space to learn our knowledge, to learn our culture, to learn our language. Then once we've allowed that time, then you may come in, then you may come to the table and have those discussions. But for so long we've been actually denied that right and denied not being able to learn our own language on our own country, which disadvantages not only Indigenous people but non-Indigenous people as well. You have nothing to lose if we learn what's rightfully ours.
Yes. From a person with experience, what is your message to that young Indigenous person in the audience or watching us through streaming that wants to do something but feels afraid to do?
It's okay to feel afraid. It's okay. But the moment that you say to yourself, I wish one day or I would like to, then it's already started. The process started. And being afraid, there's so many other people that went to that same path. Get support, mentorship, take the time, or, nourish that dream. I was young, I was 28 years old. I said, when I'll be old, I want to be at the Senate of Canada to eradicate the Indian Act. And I didn't know it was going to happen sooner. I'm not that old. So I nourished that dream.
No, we are not.
So we are stubborn. We're allowed to make mistakes. For me, it's not a mistake, it's experiences. But we're not alone. We're allowed to get help, support, and expertise, and love, and forgiveness, and also alliances. So for me, you have the gift. The moment you were born, it's there inside, and nourish that gift.
Rebecca, to finish, a message to that young leader like you. What was that moment when you make that decision to step out and fight for your people?
Yeah, so I it was kind of happening within, I had like moved out of my community, which was a very Indigenous community, and I had went to university for the first time, and it was there that I really faced discrimination for the first time. I felt so kind of alone in that like the curriculum wasn't catered towards my culture, and I felt very disconnected from my culture. And then when I went back into my community, I realized what I was missing, and that's kind of what started my kind of, I guess I would say, path onto this, is because I went into these spaces as a young Métis person, and I realized that nobody was going to change it, and like I needed to start changing it. And then it kind of snowballed from there. Honestly, I got involved as a volunteer, and then I started kind of going into these spaces more and realizing how hard it was to be a young person and to kind of have your voice silenced in that way. And then it happened kind of, there was like this one instant moment where I was standing there and I was in this like space where I had all of these older leaders who are saying, yeah, I support the youth, but, and it was kind of always that thing of,
Yes.
I support them, but, and I was like, but what, right? And yeah, that's how it was. And so I realized that I needed to be there to be like, but you need to support me regardless of what the excuse you were going to make. And I realized that nobody was gonna step up and say that, and so I was like, well, my mom always said I was loud, I was, in my language actually, my family called me a maktoon, which means big mouth. So that was my nickname growing up. And so I realized that I had a voice that carried, and I had a voice that was loud, and I had a voice, honestly. And so I was like, I'm going to step up and I'm going to start speaking out in the way that I need to speak out, especially as a Métis youth, and especially as somebody that faced that discrimination, seeing how it was to be in these spaces and try to be silenced. So that was kind of my moment where I'm like, you know what? I can really do something with my voice and I can make something out of it. And then it took a lot of support from the people around me. I was hesitant at first, and like I always tell people, I'm like, when you're going into these spaces and when you're a youth and you're trying to do these things, I'm like, do it terrified anyway, because I come into these things and I'm so scared, I'm so nervous. I'm like, I was backstage kind of freaking out. I was like, and they were like, it's okay, breathe. And I'm like, yeah, I know, but still. So I'm like, I'm unafraid to like admit that like I'm scared most of the time that I go into these spaces, because I don't know what it's going to be like. Am I going to be supported? Am I going to try to be silenced? But at the end of the day, I'm like, it needs to be done, because you need to get your foot in the door so that when you're there, they see that like you can be an example for Indigenous youth beyond you. And that was the biggest thing, is like once my foot is in the door, they can try to shut it, but I'm not going to let them, because I'm going to make sure that more Indigenous youth that come after me can get into these spaces as well and have their voices heard and supported.
Thank you. It's been a great honor to moderate this panel, to talk to such great women, strong and resilient leaders about these topics that we all need to keep on our tables alive. Remember, we have great leaders, but we need to become allies to build stronger societies. So thank you, everybody.
No,
Thank you. Thank you.
Can I ask our panel just to stay put for something quite special? But thank you to Ilya and the panel for a fascinating discussion. Give them a huge round of applause. Now, thanks to our incredible One Young World Politician of the Year, Hana-Rawhiti Maipi-Clarke, we'd like to welcome to the stage the Waikato group, who will honor us with a traditional Maori performance. Please come to the stage.